All right, well, welcome everyone to this, our latest installment in the Care Ethics Zoom lecture series. We have one more of these planned this semester, which will be on April 6th. Same time, it'll be Rika Prats from Duke University. She'll be giving a paper, Learning Through Care, Disinheriting Dominant Epistemologies to Theorize Caring Men at the Center. So I will send you all an announcement about that. And then we are tentatively planning to continue this series next fall, starting up with Professor Vrindra Dalmaya. She has tentatively agreed to talk in the fall, but I have to circle back and check with her. Our presenter today, I'm very happy to say, is Professor Sarah Munawar, who received her PhD in political science from the University of British Columbia and is currently an instructor at Columbia College in political science, I should say. Professor Munawar's research focuses on developing an intersectional and decolonial ethic of care through Islamic thought that centers the epistemic authority of disabled Muslims and caregivers. Sorry, I'm trying to let people in as I do this introduction. She's written several articles and chapters on this theme and is currently writing a book manuscript on it. I'm also very happy to report that Professor Munawar will be joining us here at the University of Houston next year, and specifically in the Elizabeth D. Rockwell Center for an 18-month visiting professorship residency. So I'm very excited about that, to have her here. And I hope we can do some wonderful care ethics type things together while she's here. So we'll be talking about that more. Our commentator today is Professor Joan Taranto, who is, almost needless to say, one of the most famous and important of all moral and political care theorists, a tireless advocate
compared to Virginia.
for young and upcoming care theorists around the world, author of 2 of the most important books on care ethics, as well as many, many engaging articles from which I've learned a great deal, and all-round good person. So we're very lucky to have her here today offering comments. Professor Munawar will talk for about 35 minutes, and then Professor Taranto will give about 10 minutes of commentary, and we will then open up the floor to questions and discussion. You can either indicate a question or discussion with the raise hand function, or by sending a message, just saying that you have a question. You can send that, and I'll call on you. We can go either way with that. So let me now thank one last time Professor Munawar for being with us today and talking about a care-based epistemology of Islam. And I will hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you to University of Houston for having me for this talk. I'm so excited to share my work. I'm just going to share my screen.
Oh, can I share the screen? Let me see.
Yeah, it says disabled.
Okay, you should be able to now.
All right. It's been a while since I went back on Zoom now that we're teaching in person. Okay, so La ilaha illa anta subhanaka inni kuntu minaz zalimin. The prayer with which I begin today's talk is known as Eid al-Karima. I prayed in solidarity with the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations, and in gratitude for the Coast Salish lands and waters that sustain my family and my scholarship. I would also like to acknowledge that all of you are joining today from many places near and far, and acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. The space to have conversation on decoloniality within academia has been created by the caring labors of Indigenous peoples and their resistance to settler colonialism on Turtle Island. Anti-colonial scholarship on these lands would be lost and in vain without their leadership and counsel. So within political science, we're not really used to hearing Islamic narratives outside the trope of political Islam, or seeing Muslim political scientists embody their Muslimness while theorizing. So there might be a bit of a learning curve today for all of you to experience as listeners and as witnesses. I hope to meet you where you are at and bridge this gap between us by sharing my work with you in the form of story. I chose to begin by reciting the Quran because it's my way of embodying humility in my knowledge relations. My pronunciation of Arabic is not perfect. My understanding of this verse is not complete, and it terrifies me to even recite it out loud so incompletely and imperfectly in the witness of Allah, fellow Muslims, and fellow social scientists. Each interpretive community and audience summons a different ghost. What haunts how I give breath to this prayer are intergenerational and embodied histories of spiritual abuse, of military dictatorship, of gendered Islamophobia, of white supremacy, of ableism, and of heteropatriarchy. These layers of violence compound and interlock, and in Judith Butler's words, they enter the limbs, craft the gesture, and bend the spine. Violence can shape not just how we recite the Quran, but also how we hear its recitation. Sidra Ahmed Chan, for example, offers us an anecdotal example in which one person who is Islamophobic and another person who is a Muslim survivor of spiritual abuse may both feel an aversion to hearing the sound of the azan, the call to prayer. So although they both share an acoustic setting and are listening to the same thing, their feelings do not share the same sonic lineage. Their relation to the aversion and how they receive the sound of the azan has a different affective history. What I want to bring attention to you today is how we come to know what we know about Islam. And in Shireen Razak's words, how can we work together for a more just world across our various ways of knowing? I introduce Islam to you as a tradition with multiple lineages. I argue that it is only through Islamic ways of care knowing that we can attend to the harm caused by and uproot the white supremacist, ableist, and heteropatriarchal lineages of the tradition within our interpretive communities. So here I'm really building upon Sarah Ahmed's notion of citationality. She defines citation as feminist memory, as chains of knowledge that help us find our way, and as bricks by which we can build for one another a place to dwell and be at home. So some of the big questions I want to ask today, and I do this through autoethnography and embodied quranic exegesis called tafsir, and these are the questions. So one, what role does care play in Islamic knowledge keeping? Whose bodies do we identify as knowers of Islam and see as capable of possessing interpretive authority? Which types of knowledge do we authorize as Islamic? And what are the maternal epistemic lineages of the Islamic tradition? So this tension that I feel in my body when I recite the Quran in an academic setting, it totally dissipates when I reflect on how I came to be a keeper of this knowledge. Through this story, I teach you the centrality of place, embodiment, and relationality in Muslim practices of knowledge keeping. And the way I will teach it to my child and pass it down as Islamic knowledge through story and ritual will always be tied to the way that my mother taught it to me and when she taught it to me. So I inherited this piece of revelation from my mother. She taught me how to recite it in August 2012 in a hospital waiting room in Ontario. At this time, I was a third-year undergraduate student studying political theory in Toronto when my father suffered a severe stroke and cardiac arrest. A white man in a white lab coat advised my mother to pull the plug on our father with the words, "The time for faith and miracles is over and the time to make a decision is now." This was when my mother invoked the story of Prophet Yunus and how he recited this verse when he was swallowed by a whale. In the Christian and Hebrew traditions, it would be Prophet Jonah. So he was enwombed within multiple layers of darkness, and this would be the darkness of a moonless night, the darkness of the whale's belly, and the darkness of the bottomless sea. So this view from nowhere seized Yunus's senses. Yet he continued to move his tongue and his heart in the remembrance of his creator. This is a story of rebirth, and it ends with this miraculous image of a wounded man delivered from the belly of a whale onto a shore and then sheltered by the shade of a gourd plant. The story of Yunus offers us a vision of God, of Allah as Ar-Rahman, which means that God is compassionate as a merciful carer and is kind of like our mother's care. That Ramadan 10 years ago marks not only my father's miraculous return, but also my arrival to political theory, care ethics, and the study of Islam. I became a theorist as I became a primary caregiver for my father, and the doctor's violent words became the first sentences of my PhD dissertation. So the epistemic plight of Muslim feminists is that our inheritance of Islamic knowledge has come by way of both harm and healing. Yet, in the words of South African Muslim feminist Sadia Sheikh, it is with a radical and critical fidelity to the Islamic tradition that we continue to reclaim our interpretive authority as knowers of Islam and our relationship with our Creator. So this requires uprooting harmful lineages of Islamic knowledge that uphold ableism, heteropatriarchy, and white supremacy. In doing so, we surface and resurface an intersectional and decolonial tradition of Islam. And this is really a project of reworlding the Islamic tradition through maternal lineages of Islam. And it requires us to do what Fatima Sidat calls sitting in difference and having difficult conversations on what we are given, what we can be, and what we can make of what we have found. So what I found is that a lot of the ways in which Islam is mobilized in violent ways by white supremacist, ableist, and heteropatriarchal knowledge formations is rooted in matricide as an epistemic orientation. So whether it is in the name of religion, empire, or the nation state, these systems of violence co-conspire to destroy our relationships with our mothers, our motherlands, and our maternal lineages of Islamic knowledge through reproducing these contexts of maternity. So images of the mother as this sacrificial, homebound carer, or this image of Allah or God as an abusive parent, this image of the mother whose caring labor and body belongs only to social reproduction, the image of a mother who ignores and denies the violence male can do to her child, or the image of God as this maternal benefactress, and the image of the queen mother or the settler colonial state as the mother. And finally, one major way that matricide happens is just through political policies of maternal separation and natal alienation. So such contexts of maternity are rooted in this violence of matricide. And this violence underpins white supremacist, ableist, and heteropatriarchal discourses on care, disability, and illness within Muslim communities. So within these discourses, the formation of man as a white, able-bodied knowing subject is predicated upon the death of the mother, the erasure of dependency, and the denigration of care work. Matricide undermines not only the epistemic authority of disabled Muslims and Muslim women as knowers of Islam, but also the value of care-based epistemologies of Islam. Such lineages of Islamic knowledge rely heavily on the medical model and uphold ableist heteropatriarchal standards of moral personhood. Heteropatriarchal readings of care present Muslim women as sacrificial maternal martyrs and disabled Muslims as damned. There is very little moral vocabulary that outlines care as a collective responsibility or looks at the precarity of care work or systems of violence that disable and also the plight of care workers. There's also very little engagement with the epistemic, moral, and affective value of Muslim crypt epistemologies. So in different and yet connected ways, comparative political theorist Hamera Iqtidar teaches us that both of these heteropatriarchal and white supremacist interpretations of Islam assume that being Muslim is this blind following by which Muslims obey established norms or tradition through servile imitation. So this representations of Muslims as followers of a religion, it's not only Orientalist, but it's also ableist because it holds that one, the condition of dependency makes one epistemically incapable of being a knower of Islam, and two, only able-bodied white secular men or Muslim male legal theorists and scholars are capable of possessing Islamic faculties of knowing. So the inheritance of Islam as a tradition is shaped by systems of ability and ableism, which aim to domesticate social reproduction as women's work and knowledge production as able-bodied man's work. Here, sense and sensibility are differentially allocated. It is through such bordering of interpretive authority that the home is territorialized as a place for care work and not epistemic or political activity. So here, in African Christian feminist Musa Dube's words, women identifying queer, non-binary, and disabled Muslims are treated as despised genders or bodies. They are seen as unfit and intellectually deficient to possess Islamic epistemic sensibilities. Christina Richardson, for example, studies how hadith transmissions by deaf, blind, and disabled Muslims are absenced from the Islamic records of knowledge because they are seen as transgressive, faulty, and unreliable. So what is at stake here is not only the epistemic contributions of marginal Muslims, but also the human and historical dimensions of knowledge keeping, of teaching Islam through story, ritual, and care. So on one hand, there is this colonization of Islam by ableist heteropatriarchy. Patrilineal conceptions of Islam as a tradition rely on epistemic gatekeeping and a conception of citizenship as birthright that can only be inherited by men. So I'm drawing a parallel here between the unequal and unjust division of care work within Muslim kinship networks and the refusal to recognize the epistemic potential and contributions of disabled Muslims and Muslim women. So matricide as a epistemic orientation works to destroy the relational ecologies of Islamic knowledge. And on the other hand, so while white and secular political theorists have built careers on thinking Islamically, Black, Indigenous, and racialized Muslims, in Aisha Chaudhry's words, are made to feel as if our belief in Islam and our identity as Muslims somehow compromises our intellectual integrity and objectivity. So in comparative inquiry, non-Muslim scholars, they naturalize travel and empathy as the desire to discover uncharted epistemic terrain, to expand dominion over the Islamic world, and to see the face of the Muslim other. The aim of travel here is to submerge and domesticate Islamic knowledge into the netherworld of the self-same. Whiteness here is a straightening device that determines what makes it into the canon and into the reach of white bodies. So as Shaista Patel's work on complicit scholarship teaches us, there is this desire to know the Muslim other and to know Islamic epistemologies without first opening up ourselves and asking why such gaps exist in our discipline in the first place. I argue that such scholarship is oriented by what Bell Hooks calls an imperialist nostalgia, in which white theorists seek to rehabilitate gaps within their self-understandings while policing gatekeeping and erasing the caring labor of Black, racialized, and Indigenous Muslim scholars in preserving Islam as a tradition. It is this desire to know what has been they have absenced, a yearning for what one has destroyed. So Such scholarship centers whiteness in the study of Islam. So here, the white body of the colonizer is read as the adventurer, the seeker, and the Muslim body or the Islamic world is read as dependent upon the white gaze and is made to feel the destructive impact of publicity. So despite the attempts of heteropatriarchy, ableism, and white supremacy to displace Muslim women and disabled Muslims from Islamic knowledge keeping and Muslim spaces, Fatima Mernissi teaches us that the whole earth is a mosque. She interprets the Qibla, the direction we face for prayer, as a cosmological orientation. So just like we can lay down a prayer mat anywhere in the world, the Qibla is like our mother's home that holds an open space, not just for our return, but also a place that cannot be taken from us. It cannot be conquered and it cannot be subjugated. So it's a place held by Muslims for one another. So feminist scholar of Islamic law, Hina Azam, teaches us that stories within the Quran convey ethical norms narratologically. So how we as Muslims make meaning out of a Quranic narrative and to what effect holds epistemic potential and prescriptive power. Fatima Mernissi calls this the dual attitude towards sacred text. The texture of exegesis depends on the person who invokes it. And so I extend Rinda Dalmia's notion of care-based epistemologies and care knowing to explore Islamic moral vocabularies of care and disability justice. So how my mother taught me the story of Yunus revealed to me that Islam is inherently a care-based epistemology that is nested within situated knowledge and ethics of moral witnessing and collective accessibility as praxis. So through this story, my mom taught me 3 critical lessons on the care-based dimensions of Islam. First, how I turn towards Islam through feminist theorizing is deeply rooted in my Muslim identity and my positionality as a mother and caregiver. The harm that Yunus endures in the belly of the whale is that he has lost his relations, his sense of place, and his situatedness. And with this prayer, he sought return, re-embodiment, and repair. My situatedness within my father's care web and as a new parent pulls at my capacity to attend to the writing table and shapes what I pay attention to in my writing. I extend this lesson to account for how political economies of attention and our social location shapes how we orient ourselves around Islam, whose bodies we identify as knowers of Islam, and which types of knowledge we authorize as Islamic. Second, the intimacy of how I came to know this particular verse will always shape its narrative texture and how I embody it as a ritual of care. Reciting this verse in community or in solitude is not only a way of healing from the violence of colonialism, but also refining my capacity to bear witness to my complicity in doing harm and oppression in my relations. So what is important here is how Islamic knowledge is mobilized to not only discipline and refine our faculties of witnessing, but also to generate medicine for ourselves and our communities. So with time, I can only hope that this inheritance of Eunice's story through a maternal epistemic lineage is a kind of medicine, or a dwelling place where my children can retreat to and in face of the violence that works to dispossess us of our faith and of our Muslimness. Third, I inherited the work of carrying out my mother's intentions to hold my family together in face of such violence. This requires me to embark upon the daily pilgrimage of assuming care as an ethical and Islamic responsibility. So whereas the forces of heteropatriarchy, capitalism, ableism, and Islamophobia displace and endanger my father by marking him as a misfit, my family and I enact this intention collectively by sustaining and holding in place a fit between my father and the world. So here I'm using critical disability scholar Rosemary Garland Thompson's notion of misfitting, and also Leah Piepzna Samarhina's notion of collective access to offer this notion of care as a collective Islamic responsibility. So guided by these three lessons from my mom, I offer care knowing as a decolonial register of analysis by which we can critically inherit a tradition. Just as traditions require continual care work to be sustained, the work of holding a place together does not end with mutual imbrication or the suturing of a wound. The problem with understanding intersectional feminism as an amalgam of our wounds is that we come to be defined by damage and loss, by what broke us, in Eve Tuck's words. Instead of theorizing Islam as lacking, broken, or damaged, what I call attention to is our complicity as scholars, as Muslims, in the work of misfitting, in authoring and authorizing harmful world-building practices. In Rita Damoun and Nisha Nath's words, intersectional Islam demands of us to hold ourselves accountable for relational modes of othering in feminist movement building and theorizing. So a care-based epistemology of Islam calls us to account for the direct sense contact history by which knowledge is transmitted. We need to be accountable for the materials that we use to inscribe, the relationships and the situated context within which meaning is co-authored, and the body which comes to be a keeper and enactor of knowledge. Therefore, I, as a Muslim reader, am empowered to make normative judgments about the traditions I inherit, and I can disrupt the reach of their colonial sensibilities. This process of critically disengaging with our inheritance does not take place in isolation. As Bilal Ware teaches us, knowledge is inseparable from the person of its possessor. Unlearning cannot exist solely in the relationship between a reader and a text. It requires human connection, and chains of knowledge by which Islam is transmitted are held in place through relations, bodies, and the lens that we inhabit. So, although these multiple colonialisms co-conspire to displace us from our mothers and our motherlands, the connective tissue with which Islamic knowledge is held in place, by which we hold one another, is this force of Ar-Rahman, of God as carer. Intersectional knowledge helps us sense and repair this tissue. I visualize the ecology of Islamic knowledge not as a chain, but as a multi-directional care web of diasporic knowledge that is held in place through different journeys of migration, of separation, and reunion with our mothers. It is constituted by multi-generational attachments, grounded relationalities, nested interdependencies, emotions, caring labor, economies of attention. So just as God delivers safe passage to Eunice, to Mary giving birth to Jesus, or Hajar in the desert, we must also hold space for the safe passage of marginal Muslims to the afterlife and tend to the afterlives of colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade. So for example, Turkish scholar Asli Zengin studies the way that Istanbul's LGBTQ communities of care mobilize to assume the responsibility of advocating for and protecting and caring for deceased Muslim trans women. So through labors of love and kin making, they perform gender affirming Islamic rites of passage and challenge the bordering of the afterlife as a cisnormative place. Saadia Hartman also outlines the epistemic repercussions of matricidal violence. She notes, because of the slave trade, you lose your mother. If you know your history, you know where you come from. To lose your mother was to be denied your kin, your country, and identity, and to lose your mother was to forget your past. So to heal from such matricidal violence, Suad Abdul Khabir teaches us that Black Muslims in the US mobilize Africa as a tradition to labor against anti-Blackness within Muslim communities and the erasure of African lineages of Islam. So for Black, Indigenous, and racialized scholar, this desire to travel homewards to our maternal lineages to reclaim our Islamic epistemic heritage, it has a different affective lineage and a different point of entry than the non-Muslim and white scholars' desire to know and travel non-Western epistemologies. Decolonial Christian feminist Musa Dube and Edward Said, they ask us to interrogate how we travel through critical inquiry and whether our desire to travel is guided by this colonial impulse to take control of a foreign land or subjugate a people epistemically or ontologically. Musa Dube teaches us that we need to interrogate how we travel within our modes of inquiry and how we represent foreign land and people as in need or desiring to be translated by white Western intellectuals and their agendas of cosmopolitanism. So a Black Muslim scholar's desire to travel to Africa to know her ancestors' songs is made accessible to her through subjugated histories of care-based epistemologies that her ancestors preserved for her. Such knowledge belongs to her community, and so citationality matters in Islamic knowledge keeping. It's important to be mindful of which lineages we draw upon and are called forth to when situating ourselves within Muslim interpretive communities. So whether it's Hajar, a single Black Muslim mother running between the hills of Safa and Marwa in search of water for her newborn, or Maryam's exile in the desert to give birth, or Musa placing Moses in the river, travel in the form of migration is a projection of diasporic sensibility. It is this movement away with and towards our mothers. The narrative textures of Islam as a tradition carry many scents from the journey of Muslim diasporas and their struggle for liberation. Such travel is not a desire to journey to other shores, but rather a continual journey of return. And the return that is sought in these struggles is not just a return of history, but also the repatriation of land and the return of epistemic authority. The location of Islam is not centralized, it's rather diffused within these diasporic histories and movements of return and seeking refuge. So whether it's Black Muslims in the US organizing against surveillance, or Cape Malay Muslims in South Africa organizing against Israel's occupation of Palestine, or Palestinian Muslims in Vancouver standing in solidarity with Wet'suwet'en land defenders, Islam is a tradition that labors for a return. It can be a return to the creator, to the motherland, to our land as mother, but the way that we embody this desire to return and what we demand to be returned is shaped by our social location and positionalities. It is this return to our mothers, our motherlands, and our maternal lineages of knowledge that is promised by God to Musa as she places her newborn Moses in a basket in the river and entrusts God to watch over him and the water to watch over him. So in conclusion, to conclude, I ask what kinds of care ethical theorizing holds us together or pulls us apart? I ask Muslim feminists and care ethicists, in what ways is our ability to witness, to respond to address and care for the histories and contexts of marginal others interrupted through the inheritance of colonial models of inquiry? A care-based epistemology of faith asks us to cultivate a sensitivity to our complicity and the way and how we can pave openings or closings in our epistemic horizons. How do we co-author material and ontological misfits in our worlds and in our relations? And how do we hold in place or displace others in our knowledge relations? Thank you so much for your patience and time in watching my lecture.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Yeah, that was fantastic. So let me now hand things over to Professor Tronto, who will give 10 minutes or so of comments. And then if you have questions, you can raise a hand or type something into the chat.
Thank you, Dan, for asking me to comment. Thank you, Sarah, for this remarkable paper. And thank you, Dan, for organizing this entire series of remarkable talks about care. Jesus Christ. Doesn't it figure that was when my phone would ring? Okay, sorry. Sarah's beautiful comments today began with a recitation of a Quranic verse, which are, in a way, her language, and embodying humility in my knowledge relations. At the outset, I need to say, though, that reading her text and hearing her comments today and reading more of her work, humility is not the first word that comes to mind when I read Sarah's work. I believe Sarah is engaged in a really ambitious intellectual project. On one level, she offers us, as you read in the paper on disability and Islam, Sarah offers a critique of an Islamic medicalized model reading of disability. But on another level, the theoretical scope of this work is really great. More broadly, she invites all of us to reflect upon her own theorizing practices. As she asks at the end of her talk, by the way, I had a text, so I'm not just remembering this from a minute ago. What kinds of care ethical theorizing holds us together, and what kinds of theorizing pulls us apart? In my brief comments, I just want to highlight some elements of Sarah's thinking that might be interesting to interrogate together in the spirit of allowing our theorizing to only pull us apart in a way that also allows us to hold together. So some starting points. You know, Sarah's starting points are uncompromising. She begins and ends with a stance that is anti-colonial, that is Islamic, and that is care ethical. By calling it anti-colonial, she means to challenge all forms of whiteness, colonialism, ableism, demeaning structures of thought. She does not exempt recent Islamic medical ethics from this critique, or Islamic thought from this critique, or theories that pretend to travel to reach Islam, or naturalized care ethics from such critiques. And her account of Islam would probably be criticized by many Islamic scholars as, at the very least, unorthodox. Sarah shows how the view of the person with a disability as somehow defective to a God of perfection belies a distorted understanding of the Islamic tradition. By care ethics, she means to offer, quote, care knowing as a decolonial register of analysis by which we can critically inherit a tradition, unquote. And by this account, some forms of what she calls naturalized care ethics are also suspect, especially if they overgeneralize and naturalize the mother at the expense of a much more important holding in place that Sarah wants to emphasize. A work that is never the work just of a mother, but of an entire network, history, situation, and of situated knowledges. So what's the vision here, and what are some issues then for further discussion? Drawing upon some central stories, her own families, the story of Hajar and of Yunus, Sarah's work goes from the deeply embodied, it's as if we're there listening to those doctors who would condemn her father, to the highly symbolic in condemning matricide as an epistemic orientation, which underpins white supremacist and heteropatriarchal discourses on care, disability, and illness within Muslim communities. So let me inartfully reconstruct some central themes and perhaps stimulate some lines of discussion. First, holding in place. Reading this text, it was fascinating how Sarah wants to emphasize that place is central to care. An important part of care is creating a place in which things can be held. Such placing and holding are collective acts, and she implies that this is true for the newborn infant, for a person considered disabled, and we might wonder for all of us. It is not explicitly, but quite beautifully contrasted with a form of travel, which aims at enlightenment or finding some other way of looking at others in the world. Now, holding in place is fraught with difficulties because often the places we inhabit are shaped by oppression, violence, or on the other side, excessive privilege, and its attendant harms to our capacities for justice. At one point, Sarah said, we always wish for a return. We always wish for a return to our mother's home. And that is kind of an interesting issue to take up. The second form, exile, or the second concept I want to talk about then is exile and home. In criticizing what she sees as the usual account of human autonomy, this is so interesting, as the death of the mother, as a movement away from the pre-birth darkness towards the light of rational selfhood, Sarah posits an important way in which home really is a key ideal for living a just life. Exile is horrifying for Hajar, for Eunice. Being able to be home, indeed creating home, is part of that task of holding in place. It occurs to me that in this way, home is a deeply anti-colonial gesture. After all, colonists leave home to conquer other lands. But struggle over whose home is always a struggle, right? Particular territory is also frightening in the levels of violence and disregard that people who both claim the same home fight about. So in this paper, Sarah doesn't really bring out the complications of what it means to wish for or to occupy the place of home, as much as I want to go along with the horror of exile and the desire for home away from exile. I'm not sure that she's not also making home a little too simple a desire here. Third, I want to talk a little bit about matricide as an epistemic orientation, because this claim strikes me as the most profound and yes, unsatisfying of the big claims that Sarah makes here, in part because she, 10 minutes, she can't really spell this out. While Sarah's claim is similar to some historical claims made about, if you let me use Engels's phrase, the world historical defeat of the female sex, it's also a bigger, more profound, and importantly, more symbolic reorientation. It's so interesting because after I read this paper, I went back and picked up my Bible. I have one. And I also picked up Dr. Google and went searching for matricide in the Abrahamic traditions. And you know what? There isn't a case in the Bible, in the Christian Jewish Bible, of a matricide. Now, my ignorance of the Quran is so profound, I'm not even going to say that. On the other hand, in the ancient Greek tradition, matricide is a central impetus in the story of the Oresteia, where Orestes kills his mother, Clytemnestra, and then is haunted by the Furies. And then Athena comes in and intervenes and creates justice as the solution to the problem of killing the mother. There, matricide is kind of at the heart of the story of the founding of civilization. But the story we're more familiar with, I think, in Western thought, is the story that our friend Sigmund Freud tells us, that patricide is the cause of the birth of civilization. So this question of whether or not matricide is really as central as Sarah wants to make it out to be, and how it might be spelled out, is a really interesting, rich possibility. Now, critics would undoubtedly say that no such broad claim about any particular culture or about humans in general can be made. And critics might also ask if there isn't something psychologically important about the separation from a mother and father in order to grow. Is such distancing necessarily matricidal? When is it good and when is it harmful? Okay, so with those rich concepts in mind, let me offer up a few expected critiques. Two. First, the suppose we won't listen critique. And perhaps you see me quoting there the first 10 lines of the Republic. What would you say to someone who doesn't start, Sarah, so what would you say to someone who doesn't start with your point of critique, who isn't interested in an anti-colonial, feminist, Islamic understanding of the world? How would such a person engage with this text? To those who would dismiss you, or who say your ideas are too radical, what kind of a response do you have? Second, and this is a slightly more series critique, I'm going to call it the Plurality Critique. My dear friend Iris, sorry, I'm going on too long. My dear friend Iris Young once said to me, you know, the world is divided into two types of people, the people who believe in the one and the people who believe in the many. And there's a way in which the metaphor and desire for home that informs these thoughts might be constraining of the possibilities of plurality. Your hope for holding in place, for example, really resonates different for me thinking about many LGBTQ people who, in trying to come out, the first thing they have to do is exile themselves from their home of birth in order to be themselves. Now, I know your goal is, as you quoted Shireen Razak at the beginning of the paper, your goal is to have, quote, a more just world across various ways of knowing, unquote. But I wonder if this emphasis on home takes you in a direction that may be too limiting for the question of plurality. But let me end by quoting again Sarah's, appreciate and quote Sarah's last sentences again, because they go by really fast when Sarah's reading them and they're really important. I ask, she says, what kinds of care ethical theorizing holds us together and what kind of theorizing pulls us apart? I ask Muslim feminists and care ethicists, in what ways is our ability to witness, to respond to address, and care for the histories and contexts of others interrupted through the inheritance of colonial models of inquiry? Which practices or sensibilities of textual interpretation delimit our capacity to care or disorient us to care for others in violent ways? Thanks, Sarah, for a lovely paper.
Thank you, Joan. Those are such powerful points that I really need and what I'm working through. And honestly, this can totally be a shared conversation. These are really big, great points of discussion.
Well, good. So with that, then, Sarah, you're welcome if you would like to say anything more about any of those comments in particular. I'd like to give you the first opportunity to say something, or if somebody wants to jump in with a question or a comment, or then we can do that too.
Yeah, maybe I'll just say some very quick points to Joan's comment and then can open the floor. Okay, so the first note on naturalizing the mother, this is something I'm working a lot on, especially as I write more about Islamic ethics of postpartum care and ways of taking care of mothers and mothering mothers. It's something that I'm working on. I'm trying to figure out what does gender neutral language look like around describing the mother. I'm looking at how do we talk about mother as an embodiment without essentializing and naturalizing and erasing other people's experiences of it. So this is a whole vocabulary that I'm working through. The other comment on home and placemaking, I think that's such a big conversation and a necessary one. And I really like your feedback here on home as an anti-colonial gesture. At the end of the day, every single human being has a right to have a dwelling place, to feel at home in their relations, however that may be. And I think an argument I'm making that I still need to work through is it mother work? Is it through mother work that we hold a place for others? Is it mother work? Doesn't matter who's doing the mothering, but is it the practice of mothering and maternal thinking by which we help others feel at home? And it's not necessarily the domestic home space or our birth home space. Home is really a dwelling place, and it can be created by multiple others, not necessarily our nuclear families. In the case of the trans women in Istanbul who are deceased, and then it's their birth family doing violence to them and misgendering them through burial, by misgendering them through their funerals, it's that violence done to them by their birth mothers and their birth family that is accounted for by their community mothers, if that makes sense. So it's Istanbul's LGBTQ community who's assuming the work, who is assuming mother work that is denied by the birth mother, if that makes sense. So it's communities taking up the responsibility of mothering those who have been kind of pushed out from the birth space, from the birth home. So definitely, I think that'd be a great point of discussion. Matricide, the word, it's quite dramatic. There's a lot of drama in it. I'm getting the word from Derrida, and Joan, as my committee member in my PhD, I know that was one of my weakest chapters too, and I want it to be a big part of my manuscript. And I'm asking myself, do I want to keep that word? Is that what I mean? So in the Islamic tradition, almost all of the stories about motherhood, care, and just like relations of care are situated within context of struggle, oppression, and violence. Like motherhood is always a story of suffering or violence or abandonment or exile. And I'm like, why is that the only examples that we're getting? Like, what's going on here? Why is it that God always has to intervene and make a way for these mothers to survive, for these relations of care to survive in such harsh environments? And what is harsh about these environments is structural neglect, people not stepping up to assume care for the caregiver and the caring relation. So in the Islamic tradition, it really feels like all of these forces of people not stepping up, of neglect, of violence, of exile, that is what's matricidal. They endanger the lives of the caring individual. And it really is like Evakate's notion of secondary dependency. It's like when you assume charge of a newborn or of my father, or if I'm caring for somebody, I also put myself in a vulnerable position that comes with care. But when you situate those relationships of care in a harsh environment, that's what I'm looking at. So maybe I can move away from the word matricide eventually, but I need different vocabulary for that violence to the mother, violence to erasing dependency in our relations. The language of what would I say to someone who thinks I'm too radical? Yeah, you just try to meet people where we're at. I always move through story, and there's an epistemic position of sitting back and listening and just being witness. And like unlearning takes a long time. It could be 10 years of conversations back and forth, of getting to a place of maybe we do see from the same place. So it's not something that happens in a conversation. And sometimes there are hostile moments with my scholarship, and I acknowledge them for what they are, and keep going. Like not everybody has to agree with what I'm saying. And then finally, home is a contested space. As much as there is a lot of feminist critique of the home, of the domestic space, of a lot of creating home as a form of violence, I do think at the end of it, home is a human right. Like we all have a right to be homed and to have a dwelling space and for our relations to be housed. Like that's something I don't want to let go of. And I also don't want to talk about it in a very simple way. Again, this was like a 40-minute talk. It's a big thing I want to work through. So thank you for such great comments, Joan.
All right. If any of you like me or have difficulties with challenge, I'll just remind you, you can raise your hand in the reactions. It's at the bottom, or just type a message. There we go. There's Maurice Hamilton question. Go ahead.
Hey, Sarah, great talk. And as a little bit of a plug for those who want to read more of Sarah's work, there is a book coming out, hopefully in a few months, on Peter's Publishing in the Care Ethics Press on care ethics, religion, and spiritual traditions, for which Sarah has a chapter, an Islamic and care-based approach to disability justice. And if everything goes according to plan, this book will be open access. So you and your students can have it for free if we work out all the bureaucracy the way we think we're working it out. I really enjoyed all of Joan's comments, and I think there's a lot that's powerful. I just want to take a moment and say what a fantastic moment this is in care ethics tradition, in that we have young scholars coming up who are just bringing all kinds of different voices to the table, and I'm very excited about Sarah's future. I'm glad she's going to be a visiting scholar at the University of Houston, and to see where she goes with Islamic thought and connecting it to care is very, very thrilling. I thought the phrase "holding in place" is just so rooted in care values and thinking, and it was such a moment of kind of bringing the care ethical thought back to where it needs to be, and it is definitely a key ideal. One of the things I like about your work, Sarah, is this: you're not afraid to, critique the care ethics tradition at the same time you're taking on patriarchy and colonialism. And I wanted to hear more about how you walk that line. I mean, it seems like you're trying to, kind of carve out a care approach that can negotiate all those anti kind of care forces. Can you say more about, walking down the middle of those big areas?
Yeah, so my PhD dissertation was like this big moment of I need to decolonize care ethics. And I was like very young when I started, and I felt like this tradition is very white, and how can we decolonize it and break all the boundaries here? But the more I read like foundational texts by Eva Kate, by Joan Tronto, by Virginia Held, like the more I read these texts, I was like, whoa, there's so much space and compassion and just like epistemic possibility in these writings. Like I would try to like assume a decolonial ethos or attitude when I opened the book to read it. But every time I was reading care ethical writing, it would only like hold space or hold possibility for me to do the work that I wanted to do. So I realized these writings, even though they're being done predominantly by white women, and they're not necessarily racist or colonial. There's just like a lack of representation in the field. So one, there is a crisis in care ethics conferences and writings and books. Like there are amazing Black, Indigenous, and racialized scholars writing now. Like I can think of 4 dissertations that are not written by white scholars, but I don't see these voices in these spaces, So one is just a crisis of representation, a crisis of citation. And the second is care has been used in very scary civilizational ways, right? And there is writing on this. But the thing is, how can we find the language to say this is violence, this is abusive forms of care, and this is care? Like how do we find that vocabulary together to say care when done like this, when it's not respecting people's consent, when it's not respecting people's agency and freedom, that's violence. And even calling that care is not right. And I think that's a move that I've seen in Eva Kate's most current book. And I think that needs to be done more, saying this is care and this is violence, but then sometimes that violence is called care. So that's a big thing that I'm working through as well. And how else what about the care ethics field? And the other thing is just like, there's some ideas of mothering that and the ways that we talk about mothering, I find problematic. So right now I'm working on an article on postpartum care ethics, and I just became a mom myself, and I experienced quite a bit of medical racism during birth and postpartum, quite scary stuff. And the way that the white midwives mothered me in a pandemic, and some of the ways that the way that they assumed this pedagogical position and mothered the mother was so scary. And one thing I want to do in my work is look at cultural ways and culturally affirmative and anti-oppressive ways of mothering the mother, not just like mothering the child, but also like caregivers, how we mother caregivers. Caring for the caregiver itself can be violent. So that's something I want to open up more. And that doesn't mean like decolonizing the field and like saying everything we have nothing to work with, but it's being very particular about the lineages of care ethics that I'm drawing upon, the openings and texts that I'm picking up on and building more on. And I'm not doing this work alone. Like I said, amazing Black, Indigenous scholars across North America and Europe and all over the global South are doing this work.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Brenda?
Sarah, thank you. That was mind-blowing, and congratulations. That was so rich, and I need to think about stuff here for weeks before I can articulate my thoughts intelligibly. But let me try, because there are 2 things that I would like to hear your responses to. And this is regarding your very wonderful idea of parsing mother work as holding in place. And in that context, I'm wondering whether in the Islamic tradition itself, whether you find instances, stories that are not gendered female through mothers of holding in place. So do you find, men, non-humans, enacting and embodying this mother work? And how would you bring that into conversation with your interpretation of mother work, your stories of actual mothers over here? And I guess related to that is my question that this, let us say, interpretation or presentation of Islam through the care ethical framework, has that been taken up to in an intra-Islamic dialogue to reflect on other parts of Islam? So and so I guess my question is the scope of care ethical interpretation for Islam, the Islamic tradition itself. And so that was one. And the second idea, the second question I had was, what is the place of excluding mindfully in your notion of holding in place? And this becomes, I think, important when you as you are trying to extend your care-based holding in place to settler colonial contexts. So are there any norms for mindful exclusion which can strengthen the very notion of holding in place? And just one last, what is the non-English word for care that you would like to use? That's all. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Like, Rinda, I must say, like, reading your book, Caring to Know, was what just inspired me to sit and write my dissertation in the year. The second I read it, I was like, this is comparative ethics. This is the way, and you really opened the space for me to do this work. It was a big opening. So thank you for writing that. And
Thank you.
And it is one of the lineages that I include now as something that I'm rooted in. These are big questions. And again, like, I would say this would be 2 or 3 chapters again in the book. Like, it's a big thing. So the first one is stories of care that are not necessarily mothers caring for children in the Islamic tradition. That's on the list. So there are stories of the Prophet and the ways that he cared and cared for his partner, but also the way his partner took care of him. There are stories of the ways that the Prophet was a loving father, a loving husband, a loving person, a loving neighbor that people draw upon. There are stories of also land and water as carers. So the story of Moses or Musa being put into the basket into the river, the water plays a huge role in taking care of him and getting him safely to the next destination and eventually reuniting him with his mom. In the story of Hajar, she's running between these 2 hills in the desert, and the water comes up from the ground out of nowhere and nourishes her and her child. In the story of Maryam, it's the palm tree and the water. Like, land plays a huge role in caring. Land is part of doula work, right? Like, they're the ones taking care of the carers. So land, water has huge agency that I want to look into, as well as animals as well. So there's a lot of epistemic potential within the Islamic tradition. Right now, I'm more limited in mother-child context, just because in becoming a mom, just in the past year, all of these stories are what I just inherited so quickly. I first began care ethics through the perspective of being a caregiver for my dad. And I realized none of these topic, none of the ways that we talk about care between mom and child can translate over to the way I relate to my father. And I found a lot of power inequities coming through when we talk about caring for, let's say, a disabled person in the context of caring for a child. So I found that very problematic through the different models of care. But now I am in this, like, I'm very into mother-child mode right now. So that's why those are the stories that are predominant in my writing. But in the next, this is my goal for the next year, is focus on finding those, not just mother-child relations, but like other relations with land as mother, relations with our friends as mothers, relations with God as mother. I cannot comprehend that God loves us more than our mother, because I just learned what it means to love as a mother. So these are big things that I'm literally processing for the first time in my life. And I wanted to translate it over into chapters and articles. And then the third part on excluding mindfully, this is a big topic right now in movement building. When should we exclude, let's say, white people from community conversations? When should we exclude cis men from conversations? Like, how can we exclude people in a way that is meaningful, in a way that's in a way that is not violent, but also in a way that respects the boundaries and consent of everybody in the space? Like, how do we hold the space together? It's very contentious, especially in the context of settler colonialism, where a lot of migrant populations have been displaced and kind of put on these lands, not with the consent of Indigenous peoples. And then how do we hold a place as migrants, as Muslim settlers on Indigenous land? What do those relations look like? How can Muslim settlers have just relations with Indigenous people? But one big thing I'm working through is that even this idea of Muslim settler and making a home, it erases Indigenous Muslims and their experiences across Turtle Island. So there's a whole conversation on homemaking, positionality, placemaking, and try to think of Islamic ways of how we hold a place and how that connects to property ownership and occupying territory. So yeah, it's a huge, huge project, but I really value these questions, and they are the next path, or the upcoming paths.
Thank you. I will step in here while I'm waiting for the next person to raise their hand. That was great. That was a great talk, Sarah. Thank you so much for that. And I think you should hang on. I mean, or at least resist giving up this concept of matricide. I mean, it's such a rich and powerful idea. I recognize, and I think you articulated some of the problems, and Joan did as well, with using that term, but unless you have to, I think it's a very powerful one. I'm just curious to hear you, kind of hear your thoughts about, something unique you're doing in the care ethical world is combining, bringing religion, talking about care ethics and Islam together. And I mean, I haven't even read that much, literature, I guess, that talks too much about care ethics and Christianity. Maybe I've just been overlooking that. I'm just, this isn't done very much. There are things like, right, No Nodding's back with Martin Buber and the IMO. But one of these perhaps areas where you have these different strains of anti-colonial thinking and Islamic thought and practice and care ethics, and wanting to create a space where we can all care together. And so one of these blocks maybe is the care ethical community's predominant secularism. So I just wanted to hear some of your thoughts, or how you think about those kinds of questions, if you could.
Thanks, Daniel. It is like a brave thing to fight to embody my Muslimness as I theorize as a scholar, just to be in this room and quote the Quran, or share with you stories of my mother and talk about a man in the whale's belly. These are big things. It's a total shift in moral vocabulary, and as audience members and as witness for holding space for that, that's powerful, right? And I operate in academia with this hope that there are audiences, there are spaces where I will be able to possess my Muslimness and theorize as I am. But that is, of course, not easy. In care ethics, I found a lot of epistemic and moral vocabulary to see how I think as a Muslim, if that makes sense. So the way so my mom and dad and our family's relationship, there's so many like different languages that we speak, not just in like linguistically, but like how we care for each other. And that knowledge, that is caring knowledge, is now slowly going on to the next generation and how I care for my child. And I'm learning like, oh my gosh, we care for each other as Muslims, if that makes sense. So when the doctor says, the time for faith and miracles is over, the time to make a decision is now, that line says you have to freeze being a Muslim and come into a secular space and sanitize my Islamic sensibilities of knowing and show up as a secular subject, right? That I cannot care for my dad or make a medical decision in a secular way. That's just not who I am. Does that make sense? So Reina Delmia says, caring encounters are epistemic encounters, right? So we care for one another's only like through our Muslimness. I cannot disembody Muslimness in caring. And a big part of the moral vocabulary I embody, that I draw upon, the history that I draw upon, they are non-secular and they have epistemic value. They have prescriptive power. They have so much value for decolonial movement building. Like the story my mom taught me about Eunice was that always be situated and ground my knowledge. I can use that in so many different contexts, right? So what I found really powerful is that caring knowledge transfers over into different relations of power and helps us kind of make them more anti-oppressive and neutralized and kind of trying to like transfer knowledge. A more human way to share what I'm saying is that the way I cared for my father, my partner witnessed this, right, in that relationship. And then when I became sick through my pregnancy and my postpartum, my partner enacted the same knowledge to care for me. So it's really cool for me to see how Muslim care-based knowledge like transfers in different relationships. So now today, a lot of anti-colonial vocabulary that Muslims have inherited through their struggles across the world are now coming and migrating into settler colonial societies. So even though I embody the position of being a Muslim settler, my orientations as a Muslim draw me towards more just relations with Indigenous people. They allow me to decenter the Canadian state and really open up my complicity in the violence of settler colonialism. And this accountability, I didn't learn it through academia, but I learned it through my Islamic faith, and I learned it through Indigenous feminisms and friendships with Indigenous peoples here. So like the centrality of place, of situated knowledge, of relationships is coming not just through my locatedness on Indigenous land and Coast Salish lands, but also my Muslimness. And they're interacting in really cool ways. So yes, care ethics is mostly secular. Maybe in the corners of it, you'll have some really cool work on the way disability is discussed in Christian contexts, in Jewish contexts, but it is on the margins. And I'm trying to say that it's not just bringing something from the margins to the center, but it's seeing how much we can learn from different cosmologies of care, whether it's in an Indigenous ethic of care or a Cree ethic of care that my friend Kathy Walker just wrote in her dissertation. It's just like there's value in different voices, but not just like gender different voices.
Thank you. That's great. Ms. Saloon? I may.
Yes, thank you. Assalamu alaikum, Sarah. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. I just wanted to say that your talk was really amazing. It's always so amazing to witness you be doing your work and being in action. And just to comment on the last question, as a Muslim woman who reads your work and learns from your work, something that I really admire about you is that you write for Muslim people. And I think that's a very important grounding framework to account for when engaging with your work, is that you are writing for us, and that other folks are welcome to engage and be guests and bear witness, but you are first and foremost writing for fellow believers and other Muslim women. And I think that's such a important thing that, like, I see myself in your work, and I think that's a pivotal part of, I think, your purpose in doing this work. And so I just want to say thank you for that, and add this little comment. Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Saloon. One of some powerful moments I've had in sharing my work on care ethics in Muslim communities is the pulling the plug conversation, whenever I share that, I always get one or two audience members being like, whoa, the same scene happened with our father or our parent or our grandparent. And we felt so helpless and powerless in facing this like anti-Muslim racism. And some people did choose to, end life based on coercion, and being told that disabled life is not meaningful. And then they were like, it's so amazing to see someone articulate that in an Islamic way, and the Islamic right to, value disabled life and think as a Muslim in those contexts. So I've had some pretty powerful encounters. It is hard as a scholar who's non-secular to hold multiple audiences in one book. So it's going to be very hard to write this manuscript in a way that's accessible to my family, to my community members, and it's accountable to me and my practice of faith, and also to academic scholars who would be non-secular. It's going to be a big labor, but I'm excited.
All right, so I would like to see what I invite anyone else in. You can, intro either with a question, or if you have some kind of comment or thought on any of these themes that have been touched upon by Sarah or Joan or questioners. Like to invite anyone in for that. Sarah, when you were answering my question, I mean, this is a half-formed kind of thought, but I just want to put it out there. But I was talking to Sarah Clark Miller recently, and she's working on a book on ethics of relationality, and she's talking from a philosophical perspective, really trying to conceptualize relationships, like that's like an ontology of the relationship, independent of the two parts, thinking about that. And when you're talking about how we care for others as Muslims, I was thinking about that separate kind of existence that where people come together in different kinds of communities, and there's something maybe missed or overlooked if you're trying to just think of that as like, right, as two people, right? There's this, there's all this space in between, this entanglement that is that really matters and needs to be understood separately. So I don't know. That just came to my mind when you were saying that. I thought that was a really interesting way to put that.
Yeah, like I'm worried. This month my goal is to write this article on postpartum, Islamic postpartum care ethics. And when I became a parent last year, without my family, it was a pandemic, so we're all in lockdown. And the only people really caring for me were the two white midwives in a secular way. And like, I cannot describe to you like the violence and the discrimination and just like the moral injury in not being cared for as a Muslim woman. And just like, I didn't have access to community forms of mothering in that moment. It was really just me, and all of this knowledge on how to mother, how to care for myself postpartum, recipes to make, like to heal my womb, like all of this stuff is supposed to be inherited and given to us through care. It's care knowledge. That's what sustains us. But I just didn't have it. And I just was like, whoa, there's such a big unmet need of Muslim carers not being cared for in a Muslim way. And it's not a need that can be met predominantly by medical professionals or healthcare settings. This is community work. And over the last 2 years, I've seen friends who are not Muslim, who might be like Indigenous or white friends or Black friends, but they've also learned ways to care for me in a way that sees that I'm a Muslim as well. It could be like sitting with me and trying to make sense of a quranic story. So if I'm, for example, like one day postpartum, I was very upset about the story of Hajar, and I was like, why did God choose her to suffer? Why is this woman in the desert with a newborn child? Like, I don't understand like how this can be so divinely ordained. I'm so sick of my mom being divinely ordained to be suffering. I don't get this. And it could just be friends sitting with me and translating and interpreting and trying to make sense of this text. And dealing with the problem of evil when it comes to why did God choose carers to suffer? Like, how do we think about these big questions alone? And then slowly shifting our focus not on like punishment and suffering is divinely ordained, but rather looking at the structural conditions that endanger caring as practice and relationship. So this work you can care for somebody as a Muslim in a secular way, but still acknowledge that they're Muslim. Like there's radical ways to do that for each other and hold places together. So I can hold place on Indigenous land in a way that totally respects Indigenous sovereignty and centers Indigenous understandings of place and occupying place. So that can be done in a Muslim way, if that makes sense. It just takes conversation and with time building dialogue and like really building relationships and looking at how we can be more just to one another.
Right, but done better for Muslims by Muslims like you, right? This is what Maysalun's point about I can do so much, but this is why one of the reasons your work is so important because you're speaking to people in a way that really connects with them and relates to their true interests in a way that you just miss if you don't if you're not of their faith community or culture. So this is great. Priya.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much, Sarah, for your work. I don't have a question, but the two things that you said in your last response, I just wanted to add to that. So I am a PhD student at IIT Bombay, and my research is on care ethics and surrogacy. So the surrogacy ban in the country, India has recently banned commercial surrogacy and has mandated altruistic surrogacy. So my research is around that. I'm just about to submit in a few months. I just wanted to kind of, speak about two things. One is, I'll just go backwards. One is about your experience with the midwife. So I am a part of one project that I met these people in Care Ethics Research Consortium last year. So we all got together and we made this collective critical midwifery studies. I'm not sure if any of you is aware of that. So the main person who started it is at University of Humanistic Studies in Netherlands. So one of the things that we are trying to do is to question, these kind of racist and heteropatriarchal structures within the midwifery and doula and very medicalized kind of, care structure. And just yesterday we had one of our monthly meetings, and this was one of the issues that we discussed about, people not getting to care for themselves in the way they want to do. And so I did not have that kind of vocabulary for it, but thank you, the way you have kind of put your work around, that you were not able to kind of get that care or care yourself in that kind of system in the way you wanted. So that is one of the things that we are trying to do through our Critical Midwifery Collective, and we've just submitted a position paper. And once it is out, we'll kind of, call for papers. And so we are trying to do something. And one is also a summer school that we are doing towards July, which is under Utrecht Summer School. So critical midwifery study, and I bring care ethics to the table there because I, along with one more person, we are the care ethicists there. So one is that. And the other thing is that in the same series where your work is coming, Ethics of Care by Peters Publishers, so there is a 2-book volume project that I'm co-editing with Professor Inge from University of Humanistic Studies, Rajante, and Veronica Mitchell, and my own supervisor from IIT. There we are looking at care ethics, birthing, and mothering. That is our broader kind of idea. And there are 2 volumes. One is around reproductive justice and another is on technology, birthing and mothering. And I come as a co-editor for technology, birthing and mothering. So I could see a lot of, connections in what you're doing. And I totally understand when you say that at times in these spaces, you don't find voices from Global South or from Indigenous scholars. Even I find myself at times I feel very lonely in this space because no one else is doing care ethics, like at least in my department or in my, in peer circles. So I find such collaborations across borders. So I'm very happy to kind of know about your work. Just wanted to put this across. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Priya. That's so kind. And yes, I've heard, I just connected with Inga and then Verdante, I think last week, and they were just so generous and kind. And I am considering offering something for an abstract for the book project as well. I'll share with you this really good piece that I read, I think 3 weeks ago. It talks about the way the profession of the midwife was introduced through colonialism in India or in South Asia. And it was really by making Muslim and Dalit dais and midwives, Dalit doulas and dais look as if they are dirty and backwards, and a lot of anti-casteist language and a lot of anti-Muslim language to make it look like the work of dais is not clean enough for upper caste society. So then there was this introduction of the white midwife, of the upper caste midwife who has professionalized knowledge and more cleaner practices. And that's how midwifery kind of like came into the scene in South Asia. I'd love to share that article with you because I've been thinking a lot about that. Also, some of the most radical stuff happening just here where I am in Vancouver is this rise of birthing collectives of Indigenous, Black and racialized birth workers, like training each other and making sure that remote communities, migrants have access to free and accessible, culturally affirmative postpartum care and then doula care. I think that's such revolutionary work, and the people who do that work are amazing.
Sure, thank you so much. Do share, and I think we are going to not co-teach, but we both are going to be guest lecturers in one of the courses in University of Humanist Studies. Yeah, I saw your name there. So
that's so cool. I'm so excited.
And I saw your name here also, so I was very happy to come here and then at least get to know about your work. So I hope we will be speaking more in course, which will be co-teaching in some way. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. And Priya, like one of my goals for us visiting professor at Houston is to organize a big care ethics conference and try as much as possible to kind of center Black, Indigenous, and Global South voices in the organizing. So that's one of my biggest dreams, hopefully in the next year and a half.
Collaborative work.
Yeah.
Look forward to that.
Totally.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, we will find a way to make that happen one way or another. So be looking for that. Maurice has been putting some stuff, some call for abstracts and that in the chat. So everyone might want to take a look at that. I think based upon these works that were just mentioned. Okay, so Rika, do you have a question?
Yes. Well, Sarah, thank you so much for a really amazing paper. And also the stuff that you sent through beforehand, I really enjoyed that. It's been super rich, and I also feel like I need to think about it much more, but there were so many great points. I'm really thankful for the work that you're doing. So I'm really also very much interested in place and in your centering of place, but I feel like the questions that I have around that are not anywhere near that I can share. Also should add that it's quite late at night for me, so I'm also, I'm not an evening person anymore, so I find it difficult to formulate questions. What I do want to talk about a little bit more also, I really like what you said about sort of the violence associated with care. I also feel that while there are great things, I also really appreciate Eva Kitte's recent work on sort of reception and sort of bringing that in order to sort of assess what is good care, etc. But I still have some ambivalences, I guess, or some discomfort around I mean, I'm oversimplifying it, maybe that's a straw man, but sort of it's just saying that it's not care. And I mean, I understand that from this normative point of view, that certainly is the case and it can be made. And I think it is also really important to be able to say that something is bad care. But I guess I'm more ambivalent about, or not ambivalent is maybe not the right word, but I feel that there's something, and I can't quite yet put my finger on it, but I think it's really important for care ethicists to engage with sort of that, those negative sides of care, or sort of, especially I'm thinking, and I saw in the paper that was pre-circulated that you also referenced Margaret Jacobs' work on sort of colonial care in Australia, Aboriginal Australia and Turtle Island. sort of, so that's sort of the direction that I'm thinking here. And I see this being picked up also in very much in our contemporary world. So for example, I'm thinking of in Sweden, I've recently read a paper, there's this like radical right-wing party, and party members talk about themselves as caring mothers, and their care involves returning migrants to their places of origin, basically. So it's a care for the nation, but also care for the other who should be in their interest excluded, etc. So I'm really, yeah, and this is not really a good question, but I just, I thought that I feel like you have a lot of good insights, and maybe you can do some thinking together about these complexities and ambivalences. So I would love to hear you talk more about sort of the violence and the sort of arbitrariness in calling or not calling things care, when people that we think are not caring insist that what they are offering is care. So maybe that is a question.
Thank you, Rika. These are the questions I need to happen at care ethics conferences: place, land, relationships of power, positionality, care, civilizational. Like, this needs to happen, and I think that it is happening slowly. There's a really wonderful Canadian political scientist. Her name is Ethel Tungohan, and she writes a lot about maternity as this really violent discourse that's been used in anti-immigration policy. So like the mother nation and like, yeah, so that's definitely a conversation being had there. And on the other hand, we have this conversation on placemaking and homemaking as a necessarily conflictual activity. And that's a quote I'm taking from Anna Yurkovich, a political scientist at UBC. And I think a lot about this, like when we say that to make a home is necessarily a violent thing, when we turn land into a home, it's very Arendtian. We're doing violence to the land to turn it into a house so we can live in it. And I think that comes a lot from Western political theory. This idea of homemaking and placemaking is very violent. And then I think about amazing Indigenous feminists and the books that I've read by Leanne Simpson, by my friend Kathy Walker. And placemaking is something different. It's more reciprocal, it's consensual, it's relationship building. Land has agency, land is witness, and it's not necessarily violent. So there's these two conflicting discourses here, right? And I think care ethicists really do need to look at how do we think about the home, right? We need to revisit that idea of the home versus the public and look at how do we make a home and what is necessarily violent in homemaking. And this idea of like, to build a home, we need to put care into it, right? Like care creates a home, but that can be very violent, especially in the context of colonizers making lands into colonies or, yeah, that's the whole conversation. But something to think about is, like, I want to argue as a person, I'm not there yet, but I don't think homemaking is necessarily conflictual. There needs to be a way for it to be nonviolent, for it to be reciprocal and based in relations. That's something that needs to be explored, and I'm working on it. But the other thing is care as violent. So let's say that somebody was cared for in a violent way through systems of carceral care, right? It could be incarceration, it could be colonialism, as just some form of political violence justified in the name of care. And then let's say that the way that they come to care for their children might also be violent because of their trauma or intergenerational violence done to them in the name of care. So what I want to look at in my work is how can we inherit violent ways of caring for others when violent care is done to us, if that makes sense. Like if we experience, like, I want to be clearer with this. If we were exposed to care as violence, that knowledge and the ways of caring we inherit, that's the lineage that we're picking up on. So for example, in the case of Islam, in my life, the way that some stories of Islam have been taught to me were quite violent, right? And now that I'm raising my little baby, I'm like, am I going to teach him those stories and care for him in that violent way? Does that make sense? So how can we inherit these violent ways of caring, or how can carceral systems of care kind of like push, kind of pass down through trauma, violent ways of caring, right? That's one thing I want to look at. So, and the other thing is, like, even though our communities have gone through things like carceral care, or colonialism, or violent midwifery practices, like even though we've gone through this and violent ways of caring have been done to us, and we might have gone through trauma doesn't mean that we don't have sources of knowledge in our relationships in the land, in our relationship with creator. It doesn't mean we don't know how to care in a non-violent and loving and reciprocal way for our children, if that makes sense. So I'm trying to look at, does violence disrupt the inheritance of loving care and waste care? Or are we doomed in this, like, you only know violence, so then you do violence? So I'm trying to disrupt the reach of violent ways of caring. But as care ethics, we always run into this wall of, can we call this care or not? Because then it messes up all of our ethical theorizing and the paradigms that we're setting up of what care is when we bring violence to the story. So it's a big like moral issue for us, and also a semantic issue. And I like the word carceral care, systems of carceral care. So incarceration, residential schools, policies of maternal separation. Those are exact politics that we can identify. But what I'm literally looking at is, like, when these things happen, when we go through systems of carceral care, how does that disrupt our ways to care for both, like, colonizing communities and their ancestors, but also like peoples whose families and communities went through that and were survivors of the violence. So in the piece by Enga, Professor Enga, on midwifery and her team of scholars, they talk about how white midwifery students, to become midwives, they have to kind of be like groomed into this culture of violence to the racialized mother. So these midwifery students have to see racial violence being done to, like, Black mothers, migrant mothers, and they have to witness this as almost a rite of passage, and they don't really have the space to speak up to it. And then I wonder, even though they were groomed into this culture of violence, can they act otherwise as midwives? Can they act in more caring ways? Can they disrupt the reach of that violence when they practice midwifery? So what I'm looking at is, in that inheritance, how do we stop violence from moving forward on both the side of, let's say, people who descend from white settlers and white colonizers, but also from the side of communities who were survivors of that violence? Yeah, so those are big questions I'm looking into. But I really like this article by Professor Enga and her team. Like, it's a good one.
Okay, we're just about at time, but I will go to my colleague Rachel and let her have the last word here.
Thanks so much. I really enjoyed this talk. I apologize for being camera off today, but I'm very excited to have you join us in Houston. And in hearing you bring this language into the conversation, which, I think about these things, but with different language, it just reminds me of the work we've been doing with South Asian youth in Houston Unite, and giving language to young people to talk about their experiences, first generation South Asians in Houston. And what we learned working with graduate students who were sometimes doing oral histories, interviews with young people, was that we really needed to do kind of trauma-informed ethnographic work. But I haven't heard you use that language as much in terms of intergenerational trauma. And so we just want to be better at how we talk about these things. And I think we could apply some of the language that you were using to what we were seeing as we built an oral history kind of archive and things like that. But we were trying to figure out, from a feminist perspective, a methodology that was hyper aware of trauma and how it's being passed down. So.
Rachel, thank you for this. And Rachel, I've already Googled you. I've already been looking who's in Houston that I can connect with.
Yeah, I look forward.
I'm so happy you're here.
Yes.
That's a great point. So as a racialized scholar writing about my family's story in my PhD, in my academic articles, it's extremely vulnerable. Like when you do autoethnography, when you bring in stories of trauma and violence, and then you're instructed through methodology and training on interpretive methods to write for white audiences, it really is like, it kind of messes you up a little bit, because you are re-traumatizing yourself in sharing the stories. You're sanitizing the stories to make it palatable to white audiences. You're always censoring yourself. And then not only are you doing that, but then you have to instruct racialized students and Black and Indigenous students to do the same work. Does that make sense? So if I had to make myself more censored and palatable for white audiences, then I'm extremely cognizant. Am I teaching other students to do this too, to survive in academia, right? Mm-hmm. So that's something I'm thinking a lot about, is how can we teach autoethnography and sharing of our stories in academic settings in a way that's trauma informed, because we don't want to be having especially Black, Indigenous, and racialized students bringing up their traumas in writing and conference spaces and in hostile academic exchanges. How do we have that difficult conversation? How do we what does a trauma-informed approach to story sharing even look like, right? Because I don't think story sharing or knowledge sharing is something we always do in academia. Like imagine being in a really toxic conference panel and a student is sharing their story, but everybody's like centering whiteness and delegitimizing what they're saying and saying that your experience wasn't real. Your experience of violence is not legitimate or not real. So it's just, how do we guide racialized students through that experience? And what do we tell to them as teachers on the ethics of sharing your stories, especially care ethics and disability writing? A lot of it is story-based. We talk about ourselves as carers, or as disabled, or as neurodiverse. We share stories in this theorizing and in feminist theorizing, but it has to be trauma-informed and it has to be relational. Like, because I know a lot of the care ethics community members and the mentorship there, and I know kind of the community practices and openness to my kind of work, I am showing up as I am today. But would I do the same in a political science space? Maybe not, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, it makes sense. And I mean, I think, you mentioned of Shaista Patel, who really goes hard in articulating, the trauma. I think that often audiences don't assume that the trauma is being created in that institution, especially because of the model minority myths that inform like who gets to show up and how. So I look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you.
Thank
so
you,
much.
Rachel.
All right, well, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you especially to Sarah, of course, and Joan for her fine comments. And I will remind you that Rika will be presenting on May 6th, her paper, Learning Through Care, Disinheriting Dominant Epistemologies to Theorize Caring Men at the Center. So we can continue this conversation then. But this was wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone. This was a great day, a great Friday. Always is when we get to come together and talk about these things. So thank you to everyone, and we will continue here. And then Vrinda, I think right before you jumped on, I said that you have tentatively agreed to present in the fall. So I'll email you about that.
Yeah, we'll be in touch.
Okay, good. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. That was wonderful. Have a good weekend.
Bye, everybody. Take care.